There were covenants in the deed about who could and could not live there.
I want to welcome you into Local Roots as we're talking about mapping inequality, understanding redlining in Charlotte. This is Queen City News Plus, and I'm Alicia Barnes. And as we talk about this, we're really going to introduce you to what redlining is, its origins, and just really connecting the dots for you to understand what really goes on in the history and where we are as today. So I have two amazing guests I want to be able to bring in. First, we have Dr. Tom Hanchett, urban historian, of course, with History South. Also want to point out that you were Charlotte Magazine. They call you Charlotte's Dr. History, and you were also named the 2015 Charlottean of the Year. So great to be able to have you on. You're a regular here. Their storytelling and your history facts are just so well welcomed and appreciated. And we also have Dr. Amy Hahn Nelson, and you are a research faculty, a member of the University of Pennsylvania. And I'm going to have you explain a little bit more as to your background so people can understand the difference between what you do and then what Dr. Tom does.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm a social policy researcher. Funny enough, Tom and I were both Charlotteans of the Year in 2015.
Okay. All right. We share that title.
We were on that stage together, but my first social policy research, and then Tom, of course, for being Dr. History.
And Amy is shy about this, but she co-authored a book about education and race and those kind of issues that we're still fighting over, that kind of looked at the busing decision in 1971. We were the national test case for court-ordered busing for racial balance. She took that story forward, and that's why she was the
Charlottean of the Year.
And
wow.
That's why she can talk very eloquently about racial patterns and economic patterns in Charlotte.
We can't talk about schooling without talking about housing. Can't talk about either in Charlotte without talking about race and history. So
let's get right into it. Let's talk about redlining. Dr. Hanchett, just kind of start us off, kind of bring us what people need to understand when you hear the word redlining. I know we have a map to be able to show of the Charlotte area, but just kind of walk us through what people really need to know.
Well, we're going to talk about several episodes in our history in the 20th century. Redlining is probably the best known, so it's good to start there. The idea of redlining is you draw a red line around a neighborhood and you go, oh, that's a bad place, particularly a bad place for banks to invest. And why would people do this? It's now illegal to redline, but back in the 1930s, the Depression was on. And banks got really antsy about lending. You might remember that from 2008, if you were around 2008, the economic downturn. Well, in the 1930s, the federal government said, what can we do to help banks be bold and make home loans and get the economy going again? And what they did is they sent consultants around to every city, talked with the real estate leaders, and they said, where are the good credit risk neighborhoods? And so it's mapping credit risk, which, you know, if y'all aren't asleep yet, you're kind of tending that way. It's really important because when you do that at a neighborhood level, you could be the best saver, the best steward of your money, the best neighbor. You walk into the bank with your down payment, they look at this secret map, and you don't get a home loan. And that means that some neighborhoods rise, some neighborhoods become much less desirable, and because you can't see what's going on, you assume, well, there are really good people over here and there are really bad people over there. It's one of the things that really has pulled apart not only our cities, but our society.
So with redlining, back then, did people know where these maps were drawn? This was all secret. Explain.
This was, and I don't think people were trying to be nasty. They were just, this was inside information that banks needed to know. There was a federal agency called the Homeowners Loan Corporation that was kind of dealing with this. And if you were an insurance company or a bank, you got these maps. But ordinary people didn't know them until one of my mentors, a historian named Ken Jackson, found them in the U.S. archives. People had heard about them, but no one had actually seen them. And the one that's up on the screen here is from a project by the University of Richmond to digitize and make available all of this material. When I first found it, I was working on a book that became Sorting Out the New South City. I had to go to the National Archives in Sweetland, Maryland, and spend a day to see this secret map.
And it's important to note that these maps were secret then, but we have the same thing happening now. We have secret algorithms that are black boxes that people can't quite disentangle the way in which that they're creating risk and credit scores. And I think when we look in 50 years, we're going to look back, and the same way that we feel about redlining maps is the way that we're going to feel about these black box algorithms that are determining credit scores and risk for us right now.
You live right now in a house that it is in a red line area. Kind of explain that to me. Explain how you came to find that out.
Yeah. So where we live, Tom and I, funny enough, don't live that far from each other, about a mile and a half. And it's on the edge of a redlined area, but we're actually in an area that does have racial covenants. So we are, our house is right on the edge, but it is a blue area. And
green was the best.
Yes.
Blue was almost as good. Yellow on the map. Caution. Red. Don't even be talking to the bank.
Pull the map up real quick and kind of go through it.
And if you go to this website that's hosted by University of Richmond, you can actually put in your address and you can see. So where I live currently right now, I actually have a map where I have my house plotted. And you can see exactly where it is. It's quite interesting.
On this map, the big green blotch that goes southward, that is Myers Park and Eastover. That's as far as out of town went at that point. Both Amy and I live in the edge of the Plaza Midwood neighborhood over on the right, and part of that area is yellow, but most of it is blue, which means that there were a lot of homeowners in our neighborhood back in the day, and that's because they were good people. Well, yeah, but it was also because the federal government said they were a good credit risk.
And it's important to note, so again, on this map, so I'm seventh generation North Carolinian and Mecklenburg County on my mom's side. And it's helpful to understand legacy here, right? So like my parents both grew up in Mecklenburg County. They both attended Myers Park High School. And they were my dad was the second graduating class at Myers Park, which meant that he was in a completely racially segregated white school. He also lived in that green space. So he grew up in Myers Park. They lived in a green, house. But more importantly, even from the house, is the legacy of that home ownership. But also he went to a school that was funded at 5 times the amount of money than if he had been Black would have received school funding. So you got to understand, like this redlining isn't just about property and wealth accrual. It's not about this generational wealth that's passed down. It's also about access to public education that often isn't discussed in this conversation. But I think that's really important. He went to a brand new high school that was the flagship of North Carolina at the time, as did my aunt and my uncle. And that's hardly ever discussed.
What do you want people to know? Because you clearly see that there's a divide, obviously, within racial groups, and people hear that. But what if somebody listening to this, for you to say, hey, my family benefited from redlining, what's kind of the take home message?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a book that I really like on this topic, and the book is simply called Affirmative Action for White People. And that's it. Like, we have benefited. We benefit now. A lot of the tax code really benefits my husband and I. That's not on as much around race at this moment, but it certainly benefits us from where we are in income, right? So we have these policies that we benefit from, and they're often not acknowledged. They're silent, right? And so my talking point for most folks that I talk to is just acknowledge we benefited from these things. My grandparents received Social Security because my grandmother was not a domestic worker. They were not farm workers. Which
early on, Social Security was not for everybody. It was for the folks at the top of the economic ladder. And today that's changed, but that momentum of history is still very much with us.
Amy, do you feel like you're finding more people who are like yourself, who are saying, you know what, I'm learning my family history. I'm learning that our family benefited from these disparities that were very, very obvious, hidden, but, so many people live through this. Is there anything that you're doing now to be able to kind of help leverage that, or anything that you want people to know?
Well, I'm very popular at cocktail parties.
Okay.
Not. I think it's important just to lift it up. It's also really interesting because we're such a growing community, right? Like, I'm a Charlottean, my husband's a Charlottean, but we're not normal, right? Like, when people meet us, they're like, "You're both Charlotteans?" How,
Right.
wow, you're both unicorns. And it is a thing. So sometimes it's just a reminder of those of us who are from Charlotte, those of us who are from the South. These are the legacies that we're a part of. And these legacies are layered, right? Like, there's one legacy of living or growing up in a home that has a covenant. There's another legacy of, parents, grandparents owning a home in an area that was green or blue. And then there's another legacy of access to benefits, such as really high quality, well-funded public schools.
Yeah.
Right? Access to Social Security and the true security, that net, right, that my grandmother received. And that was because she was white, right? And we forget that.
And people don't say it. I think that's the most important
but
thing.
They often don't know it. We're not taught this in school. We certainly weren't when I went through school, even in my undergraduate and graduate studies. It was something that was even new then. So
was it something you learned as an adult, as you started doing more research?
Yes.
On your own,
Yes.
and then obviously being interested in history and knowing what's going on in the Charlotte area.
Yeah, my original foray into this was as an educational researcher, and you truly can't understand why schools are the way they are without understanding housing policy.
Well, we're going to talk about that coming up. So much to be able to get into. Such a deep conversation, but light at the same time. More local roots when we continue next. Welcome back to Local Roots. We're talking about redlining in the Charlotte area, and we ended the conversation, and we're kind of switching it now to like the deed restrictions that we saw. Dr. Hendrick, kind of pick up the conversation now.
Well, redlining is in the 1930s, and eventually the Supreme Court says you can't do that. There's a Community Reinvestment Act in the 1970s, but as Amy Hahn Nelson says, there are still those algorithms, those credit scores, and a lot of this stuff kind of rolls on in this way that Amy Hahn Nelson is talking about, where the decisions get layered on top of each other. We may not know about the fact that we benefit from them. So that's a useful thing. I wrote a book called Sorting Out the New South City, Race, Class, and Urban Development in Charlotte. It's how Charlotte became a big city, but it also is these layers of policy.
Turn the book a little bit more toward the camera, just so people can see. There we go. Perfect.
This is you have to rub your belly and pat your head.
There you go.
It's a wonderful book. Park Road Shopping Center has it at Park Road Books. But the beginnings of this in most American cities, including Charlotte, around 1900, were restrictive covenants in the deeds for the new exclusive neighborhoods around the edge of the city, building streetcars that took people back and forth. It cost money to ride the streetcar. Why would you move out to the edge of the city? Well, an exclusive neighborhood. And what did that mean? It meant there were covenants in the deed about who could and could not live there, who could and could not buy there. Some of them were racial. Some of them were purely economic.
And we have one to be able to show you. Let's pull it up here. Kind of walk us through this one right here.
This is my house. In Plaza Midwood.
And
a lot of folks think this was only in the snazziest neighborhoods. Almost every neighborhood built between about 1900 and 1948, when the Supreme Court said the racial covenants were not enforceable, these happened. This says property shall be used for residential purposes only and owned and occupied by members of the white race only. Wow, that's written right into the deed. And there's also the property shall be used for a house costing not less than, today it'd be $300,000, $400,000. And so this racial segregation, economic segregation, written right into. It's not something that just happened. It's not something where people wanted to be with their own kind. I've heard people say that. It was engineered.
So when you can say, go.
Yeah, just one comment. My house was built in 1938, and the houses on our street also have restricted covenants. But it's important to note, when I moved in that house in 2007, we had two neighbors across the street and next door that grew up in their houses. So this isn't ancient history, right? This is today. And we have to think about it that way.
When we think about it, there's also some shame, I'm assuming, that comes with that. I mean, when you read words right here that say, for white people only, I've seen deeds that have said no Black people are allowed in these neighborhoods. And when you look at the deeds, even that you're able to pull in 2027, I mean, it's surprising that it's written right there, that it was also hidden, which is kind of confusing. But talk to me more about what it's like from your perspective, being obviously a white woman and seeing, wow.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a Southerner, born and raised here, as I shared, and very proud Southerner, proud North Carolinian, proud Charlottine, and this is a part of our history, and we have to reckon with it. But there is shame. You know, we're not taught to think about these things and how we can acknowledge them and have efficacy to talk about them and change them, right? So I think a big piece of, you know, my like day to day, just talking with my own kids around this and my own friends and family, and this is certainly a part of research I do, is just acknowledging the context here. This is a chapter of our history, and it is not ancient history. It is today, and we have to talk about it. We have to air it and acknowledge the impact it has today on the success and the thriving of Charlotte.
What are some of the things that you've heard or feedback, especially from Black people that you've spoken to?
I mean, Black people are just like, keep on. Like, they're like, do your thing. Get your people.
Get your people.
I'm like, trying.
But still, but at least having the conversation, though, because I think a lot of it is,
one
it's
of
just
the
as you said.
places that this comes up is access to schools.
Yeah.
And Charlotte was the test case for court-ordered busing for racial balance that lasted from 1971 until the 1990s. And a judge, bless his heart, said Charlotte was no longer segregated. And we have not been able to use race as a consideration as we draw attendance zones. But what this says to me is this is not something that I'm guilty about because it happened before I came here.
Right.
But every 5 or 6 years, the school board redraws attendance zones. And if you understand this, you may want to advocate for attendance zones that bring in economic diversity, racial and ethnic diversity, because for a long time it was drawn exactly the other way.
And a lot of times, just as you said, with history repeating itself, we don't know if there's something we don't know. So it's almost like what we call redlining back in this time. Nowadays, it could be called something else, and you're seeing the overall school
report grades.
Right. Yeah. Any final thoughts as we take a quick little break?
Well, let me brag on another book here and see if I can hold this up correctly. This is called The Color of Law. And if you're not in Charlotte, you're moving someplace else, get this book. It was on the New York Times bestseller list, and it talks about the things we're talking about today from a national perspective, The Color of Law.
Dr. Hanchett, I just love that you always bring the resources for us. We're going to take a quick little break. We'll be right back with more Local Roots after this. Welcome back into Local Roots. We're talking about redlining here in the Charlotte area. And Dr. Amy, I just really want to kind of turn to you now, where you've spoken about your family and how you have benefited from redlining in your family, but you've also really spoken about that a lot of people don't want to talk about this. Explain to me your personal story.
Yeah, I mean, it's uncomfortable, right? So my mom and my dad both grew up about 1.5 miles from each other, both attended, Myers Park High School, as I mentioned. And when we sold my grandmother's house in 1980, there was a significant amount of wealth created from that sale. They were not wealthy people. My grandfather was a pawn shop manager on Tryon. But there was wealth because it was a redlined area and they made a lot of money on the sale of the house. So in all honesty, like my siblings, my cousins, there was no acknowledgement of this. And then what we were able to use that money for, right? My grandmother lived until 98 very comfortably. Why is that, right? Because of these federal policies that we benefited from because we are white.
Because of it being uncomfortable or people not wanting to be able to kind of own it. Is that kind of what it is? I mean, at Thanksgiving dinner, at Christmas dinner, is just not talked about?
Never.
Nope, nobody, don't bring it up. It's like politics.
That's just Amy being Amy. Yeah.
Dr. Hanchett, any thoughts? Just to add in, because this is Amy's family. There's a lot of families that are like Amy's family who were able to benefit from generational wealth, who don't discuss it at all. It's not a topic of conversation, and that's why we're having this show right here. To hopefully this makes you feel a little bit more comfortable talking about it and knowing the history behind it.
If you don't know the history behind it, and your family has enough money to help you buy a house if you're a young person, and your friend's family doesn't have that money, one reaction is, well, my family is harder working than those people. And there's a lot of those people kind of stuff going on in our society. What Amy's work as a policy consultant, my work as a historian, is to help understand the disparities are not human often. They are these things that have been built into our laws, even if the laws were a long time ago. The urban renewal is a thing we can talk about in another segment, but that was a federal policy to tear down slums. What were slums? Slums were owned by absentee landlords. Why? Because Black people often could not get a mortgage to own their own home. And so the demolition of a neighborhood like Brooklyn here in Charlotte, zoning, the idea that zoning would protect exclusive neighborhoods, only single-family houses, that was kind of a new weird thing in the 20th century. And so understanding these pieces, to me, lessens the tendency towards shame and more towards understanding, that the coach just put us into this game. Game's been going on for a while. We need to have our strategy cooking based on what really happened, getting us up.
Yeah, I mean, we're on third base, right, at the start of the game. And I think building that awareness is critical for us developing policies that serve all of us going forward.
Explain that a little bit more so people can understand, because I was going to bridge right to that to say it's all about awareness.
Yeah.
It's one, knowing the information, but two, saying, hey, what do we need to do now?
Yeah.
And what needs to happen?
Acknowledging that policies have a dramatic impact on outcomes, right? A lot of people think like, oh, I'm successful because I work hard, because, my parents made good choices. I made good choices. And it's well beyond that.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean you didn't make good choices. Yes, you did. Doesn't mean my dad didn't work hard. Yes, he did. A thing that comes up every once in a while, Charlotte has a hybrid of district representation and at-large representation. Why do we have this? We end up with all these fights between the various neighborhoods. That's important. We need to have the voices of various neighborhoods, because various neighborhoods were shaped differently by this history. And if we only had at-large representation, we would have much less debate and disagreement, and we would be much less reflective of who we really are.
Wow. This has just been an incredible segment. Thank you so much. Any final words? I'll start with you, Dr. Amy.
I think before we move forward on anything, we have to understand what happened in the past. So I would just really encourage everyone, if this feels like new information, go Google. Go learn. There's tons of books on the topic and lots of connections to be made.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hanchett.
If you're trying to fix a car that's broken, it's useful to know how it was supposed to run when it was running.
Your analogies are spot on. Spot on. I mean, that's what history is. Yeah. And I'm glad that you guys were able to just kind of share a little piece of that. So hopefully people are able to get more information. Of course, please visit History South. Okay, your website is, if you are a foodie, if you like history, if you like just knowing what's going on in Charlotte, tell us a little bit about History South.
HistorySouth.org is all the stuff I've written and researched over my lifetime, and everything from Black education to immigrant foodways to neighborhood histories here in Charlotte. And it doesn't cost you anything. HistorySouth.org.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much for being on Local Roots. And thank you for watching Queen City News Plus. More to come. Stay with us.
Queen City News Plus. Just search Queen City News on your smart TV's app store.